I'd like to start with 3 acknowledgments. The first one is that we find ourselves on Mi'kmaq territory, and if you go on the CBU website, you can find a nice, very formal acknowledgement of that explains treaties and such. But then I was reading a little piece by Drew Hayden about how those formal acknowledgements can be a bit of a easy way out for white people like me. And so I thought I would make this acknowledgement personal. I said this to Bill earlier today. I'm from Syracuse, New York, which is the territory of the Onondaga. I grew up in Albany, which is the traditional territory of both the Mohawk and the Algonquin people. I studied in Quebec City, which is the territory of the Wendat. I'm not going to try and figure out whose territory Toronto was, because you get yourself into trouble with that one. And Ottawa is, of course, Algonquin. Montreal is Iroquois, Mohawk. It has been a discovery for me to come to the Maritimes. There are Mi'kmaq in the province of Quebec, but there are 11 First Nations in Quebec. And the Mi'kmaq are one of the smaller ones in the greater Quebec reality. But you come here and you discover the grandeur of the Mi'kmaq, of their history, of their resistance, of their experience of settlers, of their spirituality, of their culture, of their production of knowledge in this university. And I discovered that I knew very little. And I just want to acknowledge my ignorance as I stand on Mi'kmaq territory. The second one is, I'm a come from away. I'm not only a come from away in Cape Breton and in Neils Harbor, and you know, anyone who's not from Newfoundland's a come from away in Neils Harbor. But I'm a come from away here at CBU. I've been asked to speak at CBU about some things that touch on the life of CBU, and I have never taught nor studied in this university. And even if CBU has generously given me a library card, and if you don't have your CBU library card, I'm glad to inform you you can get one just by being someone who lives here. It's a wonderful gift. But I'm not a member of this community in the way that I've been a member of other university communities. And the third thing I want to acknowledge is that I am an Anglican priest and a Christian theologian, and I will speak out of my own tradition, not because I wish to be exclusivist, but because I have found that sometimes by pretending to use words that are inclusive, we actually just put our own categories onto other people. And so I hope to make my own place of being clear by speaking out of the categories that shape where I minister from and where I live my spirituality. The spiritual practice of radical hospitality and community transformation. It's a big topic. Luckily, I gave part of it away this afternoon with the students. But what I want to say is that we have this spiritual practice of radical hospitality, and that practice provides the ground for a community transformation, and by transformation I mean in a positive sense. A community growth in well-being, a repairing of certain brokenness in the community, an exploration of new possibilities for our community here in Cape Breton. And I think CBU plays a special role in that as a regional university that has international dimensions. So where to begin? Perhaps with a story about hospitality. As I was preparing my talk, I realized that I have, over the past at least 20 years, have been involved in several contexts in which Christian-Muslim dialogue has taken place in various ways. I told one story about Christians and Muslims at Laval University this afternoon. And today this evening I want to tell a story from Gatineau. And it's a story that begins in the fall 2001. And if I look around the room, we're all old enough to know what September 2001 was, and to remember where we were when we realized it wasn't a Cessna that had flown into the towers. And we remember, too, the preparations for war that took place that fall. And perhaps you remember the anxieties that so many of us felt. In Gatineau, a small group of Christians gathered. It was a ragtag bunch, nothing formal. I don't even think we had anything like a president or a board, but we were a group of Christians who used to meet from time to time. There were some clergy, some social activists, some university professors, a couple social workers, and some people who were just concerned Christians. One of them raised sheep. And as the evening progressed, we kept asking what we could do, how we should respond. Eventually, we came up with a very, very small idea. Simple, small, not pretentious. We decided we would write a letter and publish it in the local newspaper. Not just any letter. We wanted to write a letter to the Muslim community of Gatineau. You know, in terms of things you can do in life, most of us can do this. That's why most of our parishes have correspondence secretaries. I was asked with two other people to prepare the letter. And one of the first questions we asked ourselves is, how do we begin? Dear friends seemed a bit cold. Dear brothers and sisters, a bit presumptuous. Dear fellow citizens, didn't seem to reveal the place out of which we wish to be speaking, which was that we are all children of Abraham and followers, people of the book. And what we came up with was to write a letter to our Muslim cousins. That seemed like the appropriate closeness, but with a little bit of distance. And what we were hoping was that by addressing it that way, the Muslims in Gatineau, we didn't really have any names, would understand that we were expressing some form of spiritual kinship. We started our letter, we are a group of Christians in the Outaouais region, and as it is Ramadan, we wish to greet our Muslim cousins. And at this blessed moment in the year, we wish to tell you of our friendship and our desire to build with you a world of peace and justice. Like you, we have been profoundly perturbed by recent events. We have seen criminal acts in the United States where thousands of innocent people have died. And we have felt pain and we have felt anger. And we feel the same pain and the same anger seeing the sufferings of the Afghan people whose lives are threatened by bombs and conflict and also by famine and anarchy. Really a very simple letter. Probably most of you could write it. But as I look back at that letter and as I was preparing this talk, I had to dig it out. Thank goodness for the internet. I found it also contained an invitation. In the face of such violence, how to find the right words, the right gestures, to construct compassion, to reestablish justice, to build peace. This question concerns us as citizens, but also as believers. For the authors of these violence do not hesitate to associate the name of God, the one whom we adore, as Creator and God of all life. The adoration of the God of life, of justice and peace, should it not lead us to acts of courage and creativity in the common search for peace and justice? That we call God, God in English, Dieu en français, Allah in Arabic, or Manitou in Innu Montagnais? Do we not believe in this one God? We do not believe that the one God wishes the death of millions of women, men, and children. And so we went on to ask that they enter into dialogue with us on this basis in order to address together the situation we were facing. And we were pleased, very pleased, when about 10 days later in the newspaper, there appeared another open letter from our Muslim cousins. And in it, they said that they did indeed want to enter into dialogue with us. And they said how wonderful it had been to receive our letter. Privately, as we had written during Ramadan, they contacted us and said, "Won't you come for breakfast on the last day of Ramadan and celebrate with us as we break the fast?" And when we went, they said, "You know, your letter, it was so important. Everyone was afraid. We were afraid. But in addition, everyone was afraid of us. There were death threats, and they had had police protection, and the police were afraid of them in that time." And what they said was, it was a breach in the fear. We felt affirmed, we felt touched, we felt loved. I say this because I counted the words. It's about 1,200 words, the two letters together. Sometimes we wonder what we can do, or whether we can do nothing. And sometimes I think we forget the power of 1,200 words. The American sociologist Robert Putnam, and I'm going to talk a little bit about him this evening, says the most dangerous thing we do is talk to our neighbor. The most dangerous thing we do is talk to our neighbor. A simple exchange of letters had challenged the forces of stigmatization and social isolation. In the giving and receiving of invitations, and I find this terribly important to say right now, that radical hospitality is not just about welcoming the other. It is also about allowing the other to welcome us. Which means you need to know a few things about being a good guest, and I'll get back to that. but in the giving and receiving of invitations, we had transformed strangers into neighbors. And this, it seems to me, is the essence of radical hospitality. And Doug and I were looking at the students in the cafeteria this afternoon. And it struck us that there were a lot of invisible walls. At least I don't know if I saw a lot of invisible walls. I think one of the works of chaplaincy has to be, how do these strangers become neighbors? But our story didn't end there. Well, my part in the story ended very rapidly after, because I ended up being ordained, and then I ended up in this place called Neels Harbor, which I love, but there, I'm here, and they're there, and I never knew. But in November of 2015, is Wendy here? No, she said she might be here. I was reading the CBC News, the Ottawa News, and all of a sudden there was an article that began, a priest and an imam walked into a Moroccan restaurant. The journalist points out that this sounds like a bad joke. But she goes on to tell how there is this group of Christians and Muslims in the Gatineau area who at that time were working together to welcome two Syrian families who were in Lebanon. And as it happens, I looked at the picture with the article and I said, I know those people. It's always fun. I know them. And it was this group of Muslims and Christians who had continued their relationship for 14 years since that letter in 2001. And when the Syrian refugees crisis happened, they decided that they would sponsor two families. Bill, you're doing one family at your parish, right? Yep. Okay, two. And they said, and we had to have one Muslim family and one Christian family, because otherwise it wouldn't make any sense. And here I think we see the transformative power of radical hospitality. One simple gesture, 1,200 words, black print on white paper, gave birth to a new act of hospitality. And in my head, I hear Jesus saying, and the tree shall be known by its fruit. Robert Putnam, of whom I will say more later, says in his book, Better Together, that society as a whole benefits enormously by those who choose connective strategies in pursuit of their particular goals. Community building, community transformation, he argues, depends on relationship building. Knowing one another, speaking with one another. He's not a romantic, arguing with one another. Finding common ground are all essential activities in a healthy society. And he goes on, and I think this is important in our present context, where everything gets broken down into technique and procedure, that this is more than just strategy. Relationship building, community transformation, based on relationship is a way of seeing the world and being in the world. And I think this is where we return to the importance and the necessity of spiritual traditions that value welcoming the newcomer, the outsider, the stranger, the potential neighbor, in and through the practice of radical hospitality. Now, I did a little radio interview, and it struck me as I was doing it that I was going to need to say what I meant by spiritual practice. There's a lot of that kind of language being thrown around, especially if you hang around people who claim to be spiritual and not religious. I used to be a teacher, so here I go. There are 4 words. If I were teaching, I'd have a chalk and I'd go write them on the board. And I write really badly. No one can ever read what I write, but it helps me. Spiritual practice is intentional. It is grounding. It is holistic. And it is comprehensive. So let me unpack those in my Christian language, which I suspect more than one person in this room shares. Spiritual practice is an intentional turning toward God so that through God's grace, I may deepen my awareness of God's love and respond in love to God's self-revelation. I think that's not too convoluted, although it is a lot of kind of figure eights in there. The second is that it is grounding. It is the conscious centering in everyday life on love of God and love of neighbor. It is a holistic practice that embraces, I'm going to sound very Anglican, Brenda, sacrament worship and prayer, meditation on the Word of God in Scripture, daily living modeled on Christ, service of neighbor, and fellowship with others. Selma, is that Anglican sounding to you too? Yeah. A nice rule of life. Page 559, I believe, in the Book of Common Prayer. And it is comprehensive. Comprehensive in that it's a purposeful reconciling of seeming opposites. And if I'm spending so much time defining it, it's because there's a lot of people who seem to think that if you get a cushion, shut your eyes, and sit on it, that's what spiritual practice is. It is prayer and action, service and contemplation, solitude and community, surrender and initiative, grace and responsibility. Now, I said all those words that it should have sounded very Christian. And if you weren't Christian, you might be going, well, I recognize some of those words. I'm not sure what some of them mean, and I'm not sure you use all of them the same way I do, but that feels somewhat similar. But they might also be saying there are things missing. I said I keep running in my life as I was thinking about this of Muslim-Christian dialogue. I was once at this great colloquium on the politics of love. It was great. And there was this Muslim judicial scholar who was wonderful. But at one point he said, we don't know anything about the interior life of God. And all of a sudden I went, I do. That's the dance of the Trinity. I thought, wow, what a great insight. about how we think about God. Now, I don't know that I'm more right than he is, or that it's his sense of the total transcendence of God with regards to the revelation of God's internal life. But yeah, there's different ways, and that's good. But mine is the dance of the Trinity, which is so much fun. And yet, even with those differences, and I have to tell you, this conference was in Syracuse. We're at Syracuse University. I'm next to this Muslim law scholar. He's given his paper. We're both on treadmills in the hotel talking about his talk. So we find these places where we come together, even though we have different language and different traditions. And so spiritual practice is non-exclusive. And by this I mean that not only do we recognize other spiritual traditions, but that we value them and celebrate them, and that we are open to learning from them, and that we journey with their practitioners respectfully, that we look to supporting their growth, and that proselytism and radical hospitality are totally incompatible. We're not here to convert faithful Jews, pious Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus. That's not what we're here for. And the other thing I want to add to this, it's really important, because the other thing with the sit on a cushion, shut your eyes, and forget you have a mind. Have any of you run into that vision of spirituality? I have a lot. Sit on a cushion, shut your eyes, forget you have a mind. I was liberated the day there was this priest who looked at me and he said, if God gave you a mind, you don't think he wants you to bring it to prayer? I went, oh, yeah, right. C.S. Lewis, with whom I often disagree, did teach me when I was young that there is more spiritual growth to be had from wrestling with a theology problem, a pencil firmly gripped in your teeth, than from reading a great number of pious devotionals. So, there we are. And how much time do I have left? Ah, dear. We started at 7:15, right? Yeah, that's what I'm going to believe.
Cancel recess.
I think now I want to come back to the question, having said something about spirituality, about hospitality itself. And I'm sure because there's a hospitality school here, right? They train people in hospitality. When we talk about hospitality, we're referring most of the times to welcoming guests, making them comfortable in our homes and at our tables. Restaurants and hotels combine together to create, we've got lots of this north of Smoky, and by the way, I invite you to come and enjoy it, the hospitality industry, whose very purpose is to give people a place where they can feel at home away from home. And while we might occasionally tire of guests, I have one neighbor who says she really looks forward to the 31st of October when all those people go away. And some restaurants or hotels excel more than others at being attentive to your smallest of creaturely needs and desires. It's really hard to see what's radical about visiting a friend or a few days spent at the Celtic Lodge. Doesn't really feel very radical, does it? The spa is very nice and it's fairly cheap. You can come for a day. And you get a good massage too. But I think if we look at the word itself, we're going to begin to understand what's radical about hospitality. I don't know if you ever did word families when you were in grade school. It was really hard for my daughter. She was in school and she'd come home and she'd go, sun, sunny, sun and sunshine, sunny soleil. And all of a sudden she didn't know what was happening, and we had to explain to her what being bilingual was. Hospitality, the host who welcomes us, the hotel or hostel that offers us a night's rest, the hospital that cares for us when we are ill. All these words make us feel good. Even the distantly related, I looked this up on the internet, word guest seems quite friendly. Although some of us are rather rattled by unexpected guests. But then there are the other family members. Hostility, hostage, hostile, host, as in the Lord of hosts, meaning army, and even meaning invading army. Suddenly we're feeling less comfortable, less inviting. And I don't find any of those words particularly friendly. And I'm not even going to mention ghosts, which, like guests, is distantly related. But then we're going to get into the territory of friendly cartoon characters, and all of you are old enough to know who I mean. Yes. Behind all these words, friendly and unfriendly, is the Latin root word hostis, meaning stranger. Undoubtedly, we need to be gracious in our relations with our loved ones, with family members, and with friends of friends. But at its root, hospitality involves turning the stranger, the hostis, into a neighbor. It is, as Putnam says, the most dangerous thing we do to talk with our neighbor. And I want to take that one step further and suggest that the most prophetic action we undertake is to welcome the stranger and become their neighbor. Let me go back to that report from CBC, Gatineau. These people breaking bread together at the Gatineau restaurant, some wearing crosses and other hijabs, have formed a union to be admired. But the imam and the priest are not naive. They realize this unique partnership is not universally appreciated. I have lots of friends who say, "Why do you get involved with this? The Muslims, they have a hidden agenda." And working with them, I'm sure they don't have a hidden agenda. A lot of prejudice fall when you know them, when you get involved. I'm proud to say I have Muslim friends. The imam said similar prejudices were held by some of his followers, and that these had disappeared too. We are not trying to make a cocktail of two religions. That would be unethical and unproductive. I always say, before being a Christian or Muslim, Buddhist or Jew, we are human, and we find our common humanity in this kind of effort. And so we arrive at welcoming the stranger. And when I talked with the young ones and the older ones who came to be with them this afternoon, and these students are younger than my daughter, and I'm feeling very old, I talked about Matthew 25 and how it transformed into the rule of Benedict, where we were invited, commanded to welcome the visitor as Christ. I want to assume you all know that. And if you don't, you could talk to some of the people who were there this afternoon. I want to go back to another place in our biblical tradition, to the Hebrew Scriptures, where we hear again and again God say, "Remember that you were a stranger in Egypt." You know, one of the good things that faith communities have done in this country is refugee sponsorship. And in case you think that's a rather plain thing, Canada is known throughout the world for this system by which people sponsor, private citizens come together to sponsor refugees. Not that, I mean, we have refugees that are settled by the government, and we have refugees that turn up on our border and say, I need asylum. But we also have refugees who come because Bill's parish, how much did you raise in that weekend?
53,000.
Could you come and just do an hour in my parish? Can I just rub your shoulder or something? $53,000. And you know, Pleasant Bay United. Do you all know where Pleasant Bay is? Okay, who knows where Pleasant Bay is? Yeah, okay. It's a little tiny United Church. You know, some Sundays they get 8 people. That's their big crowd. And they join forces with people in Shetty Camp to welcome a family to Shetty Camp. And across this province, across this island, across this country, people have been doing that. And not just Syrians, although the Syrian thing was kind of like the big pop, kind of like the Vietnamese boat people. We have this program, and our churches have provided our faith communities the institutional framework that allows us to do this. And that is wonderful, and that is special, and we should celebrate it. It is a spiritual practice, and it is an expression of our spiritual practice, and it's important. Eli Wiesel, some of you are familiar with his work, I'm sure. He's a Jewish thinker who survived the Holocaust as a teenager and who has written about that experience, but who has also been involved in the international refugee movement back in the 80s. I'm not going to ask who's old enough to remember the 80s. I'm afraid some of you wouldn't be, and then I'll feel really old. As the wars were exploding in Central America and people were fleeing, and there was a sanctuary movement, and he was asked to write about that movement. And it's actually, if anybody's, I'm going to leave this for you. I think you should make this available. It's a very short piece, but he ends with this. Who was the first refugee? Moses? No. Abraham? No. Adam. Adam was our grandfather, and Adam was our first refugee. I'll tell you when and how it happened. It had something to do with his wife. But if not with his wife, it had something to do with a serpent. The serpent was actually very good, because later I imagine the Bible knew that a certain Sigmund Freud would come along. I remember how it happened. We all remember that one day Adam fled. You can't hear me, can you? Adam fled. He committed a sin and he fled, at which point God said to him, "Where art thou?" He says it in Hebrew, but I'm not going to try that. What beautiful words in the Bible. Adam, where art thou? The specific story tells us that one day, a great Hasidic master, the founder of the Lubavitch movement, was in jail. He too was a refugee. The warden of the prison came to see him and said to the rabbi, "I know that you know the Bible. Maybe you can answer me. In the Bible, it's written that God asked Adam, 'Where art thou?' It is conceivable that God didn't know where Adam was. Is that conceivable?" And Rabbi Meyer Solomon answered, "God knew. Adam did not." Do we know where we are? That is, Do we know our place in history? Do we know our role in society? I can tell you of my experience and of my learning again, which I have inherited from centuries of sages and disciples. My place is measured by yours. In other words, my place under the sun or in the face of God or in my own memory is measured by the distance it has from you. In other words, if I see a person or persons suffer, and the distance between us does not shrink, oh, then my place is not good, not enviable. Where am I? I am where you are. And if not, who knows where or whether I am at all? In conclusion, what is sanctuary? The sanctuary often is something very small. He doesn't say it here, but I want to say it's 1,200 words. Not a grandiose gesture, but a small gesture towards alleviating human suffering and preventing humiliation. The sanctuary is a human being. Sanctuary is a dream. And that is why you are here. And that is why I am here. We are here because of one another. And because I think the time is running, I'm going to skip over being a good gift and positive silence, all of which are important. But I'm going to skip to Putnam because I keep talking about him. And he is fascinating, and among other things, he wins one of the, there's a list of 10 best book titles in the world. One of them is his book, Bowling Alone. Isn't that a great title? Bowling Alone. It says everything you need to know about him. Putnam was interested in democracy, how it works and why it works and how it doesn't work and why it doesn't work. So he went to Italy. Because in northern Italy, democracy works. There's relatively little presence of organized crime and relatively little corruption. Nothing out of the ordinary for, say, compared to BC. Okay? We're fine. You all know there's charges out now. But in southern Italy, the mafia's got its hold on communities. Democracy doesn't work. And there's lots of corruption everywhere. In fact, you can't get anything done if you don't have an extra few euros, I guess, these days. So we wanted to understand it. So we started doing comparison studies of northern and southern Italy. And what he discovered is that the relationships, the social relationships in southern Italy are closed family relationships. And there's relatively little socializing, social life, what we call associative life outside of family networks. In northern Italy, there are still families, but they also have community organizations. And so his thesis was, we found it. You need community life in order to have a healthy, democratic society. And he came home to America, and he started to study in his own country what was happening in the US. And what he discovered is what he calls the collapse of American community. Bowling alone. Do you remember bowling leagues? Do you know across this continent, bowling alleys are closing? Yeah. Yeah. Bowling alone. People no longer belong to bowling leagues. And all sorts of other things. He said, over the past generations, America's communities have gone have undergone profound social and cultural changes, which meant that as the new millennium dawned, we were no longer building the dense webs of encounter and participation so vital to the health of ourselves, our families, and our politics. This was written in the 1990s, by the way, okay? So listen, but you can think about what you saw on the news this weekend. These changes included the privatization of leisure time that accompanied the explosion of electronic entertainment, the labor market changes that drew even greater numbers of adults out of house-based unpaid labor and into long hours of paid employment. Where did the ladies' groups go? And the suburban sprawl that bifurcates our communities of residence from our communities of work. Reweaving social webs will depend in part on the efforts of dedicated local leaders who choose to pursue their goals through the sometimes slow, frequently fractious, and profoundly transformative route of social capital building. But reweaving will also depend on our ability to create new spaces for recognition, reconnection, conversation, and debate. Creating these spaces will require innovative uses of technology, creative urban and regional planning, and political will. Radical hospitality takes us out of the private, closed set of relationships in which we are more and more enclosed, and lets us reach out to people who are not like us, and to welcome invitations from people who are not like us. And in doing so, it helps us to reweave society. You know, in Cape Breton, what I hear a lot is people don't socialize anymore. All of you who are in parishes, you clergy, do you hear this? People don't socialize anymore. The kids, they're inside doing this, they tell us. They don't mention that what killed Anglican Evensong is they were all home watching Ed Sullivan. Because I have to tell you, it is not necessarily the technology. We will never have a local newspaper north of Smoky. But we do share news. I just flipped up my Facebook and their card game is canceled, someone needs a part for their truck, and the basketball team is fundraising. Which are all good uses of Facebook. There are bad uses out there, but there are bad uses of everything, as I pointed out when I was preaching about the wine at Cana. We need to build relationships in two ways, he says: binding or bonding relationships and bridging relationships. I'm not going to give this challenge to Doug. I want some time to come and visit CBU, and you're going to tell me how you broke down some of those groups in the cafeteria. So that it's not all these international students, except they're the Chinese there, the Kerala Indians there, the Pakistanis over there, a few Africans there, and the poor girl from English who's sitting there going, I don't know anybody. Because there were only 29 kids in her high school class, and most of them went and did something else. And she's got to wait to get to Alberta to know people. How do we build these relationships? How do we model the building of these relationships? And what does this mean for CBU as a port of entry. See, Bill, I didn't forget, we talked about that. And it's where I really thought, well, who am I to tell CBU what to do? I'm going back to Neils Harbor. Except there are a couple things here that I think are important. One of which is CBU is a port. I actually said the kid from Meat Cove who arrives at CBU feels as lost as the kid from Kerala. Okay? So there's a lot of people who need to be connected. A lot of people who need to be connected. And I do know, my daughter went to Europe to study in 2007, and it is now 2019. And every fall, a bunch of them, they're Romanian, Ethiopian, German, American, I think there's some Latin Americans or Spaniards in there. They get together sometime between Canadian Thanksgiving and American Thanksgiving and have a turkey. Okay? They're bridged. Okay? Universities do that to people. That's why all you Francis Xavier guys, you're walking around with that little ring on. Because you could be in an airport in Beijing and you run into somebody who's got that ring on, and they're your friend. Universities do that. And at this age, and I said to, I've forgotten her name, the young lay chaplain, Sumi, I said to her, and my friends who were in Newman with me when I was 16, 17, 18, which is how old I was when I went to university the first time, and we're all still involved with church stuff. Okay? So it's a time of bridge building, of stepping out of your family and of meeting other people. And it's a time of discovery. And so that is one of the things we do. But it is also a time when after they leave, what happens after they leave here? Now I know that one of our hopes is that some of them will stay. And I'm going to disappoint you by saying I hope more of them go home. But that's going to be important for Cape Breton also. Because Cape Breton is going to have a network throughout the world. My fishery co-op, which has signed some huge, humongous amount of money contract for selling lobster to China. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the manager they end up working with is somebody who trained at CBU? Okay? Just to kind of put that out there is, it's not just we're enriched if they stay. We're enriched when they go home. And we have also shared our wealth. Because to be clear, they're here because we are able to have, because of our wealth, a good university. Okay? We have, nobody pays bribes here to get grades, at least I hope not. And it's the exception, not the rule. I've been in places in this world where the only way you get your paper graded is if you pay the bribe. Then you negotiate the grade. So I think it's important to see that radical hospitality, if as chaplaincy, if as people involved in the community, we can model this and live this in all sorts of different ways. We can help CBU to be part of reweaving the fabric of Cape Breton society. So that the kid from Meat Cove, I don't even know if there's anybody from Mead Cove right now at CBU, but if you want to talk about Edge of the World, let's talk Mead Cove. And the kid from Kerala come together to transform the world, to build peace, to imagine justice, and maybe to welcome the next generation of strangers. There, how's that?